started with a leak in the upstairs bathroom and a need for a pipe wrench I hadn't seen in 6 months. I went down to the basement of my private house, a place I knew by heart, or at least I thought I did. It smelled of dampness, concrete, and that specific heavy scent of earth that settles in places without windows. The beam of my phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing the familiar metal shelves lined with jars of solidified paint and boxes of holiday decorations. But the geometry of the room was wrong. In the far corner, where the solid load-bearing wall bordered the foundation and the wet soil beyond, the shadows seemed to pool thicker than the rest of the room. There was a pile of things there that didn't belong to me. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling slightly. It was a barricade of forgotten objects. There was a high-backed armchair upholstered in rotting velvet, the color of dried blood. Sitting on it was a plush rabbit doll, missing an eye, its remaining glass button reflecting my light with a dull, malevolent glint. Next to it were rusty bird cages stacked like a totem pole, all empty, all with their little wire doors hanging open. I had never bought these things. My wife hadn't bought these things. They looked less like storage and more like a lure. Feeling a strange, watery chill in my stomach, I began to dismantle the pile. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from a sudden, primal aversion to touching these objects. They felt greasy. When I shoved aside a heavy cedar chest that reeked of formaldehyde, I saw it. The door. It was impossibly small, no more than 1.5 meters high, covered in a black matte metal that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I reached out, expecting the cold bite of iron, but the surface felt smooth, dense, and room temperature. It felt like frozen bone. "This is impossible," I muttered. Behind this wall was 5 feet of soil, clay, and the thick, strangling roots of the oak tree in the backyard. There was no space for a room. There was no space for anything. But curiosity is a parasite that eats logic. I grabbed the latch. It didn't make a noise. Instead, it gave way with a wet, yielding resistance, like pulling apart a piece of raw meat. The door swung inward, revealing not earth, but a void. I crouched down, ducking my head, and stepped over the threshold. The transition was instantaneous and violent. The smell of the basement vanished, replaced by the stinging scent of ozone and sterilization fluid. My flashlight beam hit walls lined with perfect white ceramic tiles, gleaming under an unseen light source. It looked like an operating theater from the 1950s. In the center of the small, sterile room stood a solitary metal table. On it sat an antique gramophone, its brass horn tarnished black. The needle was down, digging into a spinning vinyl record, but there was no music. The cylinder turned in absolute silence. "This is crazy," I whispered. The air here was dry and electrified, making the hair on my arms stand up. I took a few steps inside, mesmerized by the architectural absurdity. A sterile white cube buried in the dirt. Suddenly, the gramophone's needle shifted. The record continued to spin, and while I heard nothing, I felt a low, vibrating pressure in my jaw, a sub-bass frequency that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. It felt like a massive machine breathing underground. Panic struck instantly, cold and sharp. The reptile brain took over, predator, trap, run. I turned on my heel, desperate for the safety of my damp, familiar basement with its jars of pickles and broken tools. I lunged for the black door, grabbed the bone-like handle, and threw myself back over the threshold. But my basement wasn't there. My foot didn't land on concrete, it sank. I stumbled, catching my balance, and swept the flashlight around wildly. The shelves were gone, the velvet chair was gone, the concrete walls were gone. Instead, I was standing in an endless, dim corridor. The walls were covered in peeling, dirty yellow wallpaper that looked moist to the touch. The floor was submerged in ankle-deep water, dark and viscous like old oil, swirling around my boots. The ceiling was impossibly high, lost in the gloom, where old fluorescent lights flickered with a maddening, inconsistent rhythm. I whipped my head around to look at the white room I had just exited. It was gone. The door had vanished into the seamless stretch of yellow wallpaper. There was no way back. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. No service. The screen flickered and dimmed, the battery draining before my eyes. And then I heard it. From the darkness of the corridor, from the direction where my house should have been, came a sound that froze my blood. It was the wet, slapping cadence of a sprint. Heavy, rhythmic impacts were hitting the oily water, getting louder with every second. It wasn't stumbling or wandering, it was running. And it was coming straight for me. I didn't verify the threat. I simply reacted, my body moving on a primitive current of adrenaline. I ran. The dark, oily water was heavy, clinging to my boots and shins like dragging weights. Every stride was a battle against the viscosity, burning the muscles in my thighs. The corridor stretched out before me, an endless throat of peeling yellow paper and flickering lights that offered no depth perception, only a nauseating repetition. The footsteps behind me were gaining ground. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a shape about 30 meters back. It was humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, swinging with a chaotic, loose-jointed momentum that defied anatomy. It wasn't wearing a monster's skin. It was wearing flannel, blue flannel. It was wearing my shirt. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The thing chasing me wasn't a beast. It was a rough draft of me. Its face was a blur of pale, unformed flesh, devoid of eyes or a mouth, like wet clay that hadn't been sculpted yet. I faced forward, forcing my legs to pump faster, terror overriding the exhaustion. The air in the corridor tasted metallic, like chewing on aluminum foil. The lights overhead surged, glowing with a blinding intensity before plunging the hallway into near-total darkness, then flaring up again. Ahead, the endless yellow wall was broken by a heavy steel fire door. It was my only chance. I lunged for it, my fingers slipping on the cold metal handle. I threw my weight against it, praying it wasn't locked. The mechanism ground against the frame, stiff with rust, but it gave way. I fell through the opening, slamming the heavy steel slab shut behind me. I fumbled for the locking wheel, a large, industrial valve, and spun it. The bolts engaged with a vibration that shook my arms. I collapsed against the door, gasping for air, my lungs burning as if I had inhaled glass. I waited for the impact. I waited for the thing outside to throw itself against the steel, to scream, to batter the metal until it buckled. But nothing happened. There was no collision, no scratching. The rhythmic slapping of footsteps in the water had ceased the moment the door sealed. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I pressed my ear against the cold steel, listening. I could hear the blood rushing in my own head, but from the other side of the door there was absolute stillness. It wasn't waiting, it was gone. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling, and turned to see where I had trapped myself. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't in a maintenance room. I wasn't in a bunker. I was in my kitchen. It was identical to the one I had left upstairs 20 minutes ago. The granite countertops, the coffee maker with the green light still on, the half-empty fruit bowl on the island. The refrigerator hummed with a familiar domestic vibration. For a second, a wave of hysterical relief washed over me. I had looped back. The door had been a shortcut. I was home. Thank God, I whispered, stepping onto the tiled floor. My boots left muddy, black prints on the pristine white ceramic. I walked toward the sink to wash the oil from my hands. I reached for the faucet, but then I looked up at the window above the basin. In my real house, this window looked out onto the backyard, the oak tree, the fence, the neighbor's roof. Here, the glass was pressed tight against a wall of dense, black soil. I stepped back. I looked at the sliding glass door that should have led to the patio. Soil, thick, compacted earth mashed against the pane, with pale, white roots worming their way across the glass like veins. I wasn't home, I was buried. I ran to the hallway that should have led to the living room. It didn't. The hallway ended abruptly in a smooth wall of that same bone-like white tile I had seen in the gramophone room. I was trapped in a replica of my own house, encased in the earth, sealed inside a concrete box. Then the refrigerator door opened. I hadn't touched it. It swung wide, the internal light illuminating the kitchen, but the shelves weren't filled with food, they were removed. Sitting on the bottom rack, curled into a fetal position, was the one-eyed rabbit doll from the basement. And behind me, from the living room that shouldn't exist, the landline phone began to ring. The ringing of the phone was a physical vibration that rattled the receiver against the cradle. In this sealed, buried tomb of a kitchen, the sound was an impossible lifeline to a world that still had sky. I stared at the device. My hand moved on its own, trembling, reaching out to grasp the cold plastic. I lifted it to my ear. There was no static, the connection was crystal clear. "Did you find it, honey?" It was my wife's voice. It was casual, warm, infused with the mundane comfort of a Tuesday afternoon. She was upstairs. She was just a few feet of soil and concrete away. I opened my mouth to scream, to beg her to call the police, to tell her I was trapped in the earth, but my throat seized. The air in my lungs turned solid. Before I could force a sound out, I heard a voice answer her. "Yeah, got it. Just had to dig through some junk. Coming up now." It was my voice. It wasn't a recording, it wasn't a mimicry. It was me, speaking with the casual cadence I used every day. "Okay, hurry up," she said. "Dinner is ready." The line went dead. The receiver slipped from my numb fingers and swung against the wall like a pendulum. I wasn't the man on the phone. I wasn't the husband coming up the stairs. I looked at the steel fire door I had locked. The heavy iron wheel I had spun to seal it shut began to turn. It moved slowly, grinding against the rust, driven by a hand on the other side that possessed impossible strength. I backed away, retreating until my spine hit the cold glass of the sliding door, the roots outside pressing against my back like tangled fingers. The wheel stopped, the door swung open. The figure from the corridor stepped into the kitchen. It wasn't running anymore, it walked with a calm, proprietary stride. The blue flannel shirt was dry now, pressed and clean. It stopped in the center of the room, under the harsh fluorescent light, and looked at me. The blur of wet clay was gone, the face was finished. It had my eyes, it had the small scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident. It had the exact pattern of stubble on my jaw. It looked at me not with anger or hunger, but with a terrible clinical pity. It looked at me the way a man looks at an old coat he is about to throw away. I looked down at my own hands. They were changing. The skin was turning translucent, waxy. My fingers were fusing together, the knuckles dissolving into a smooth, featureless mitt. The fabric of my clothes was losing its texture, blending into my skin, becoming a velvet upholstery the color of dried blood. I tried to run, but my legs were gone. I was no longer standing. I was slumped, heavy and lifeless, unable to lift my own weight. The entity that wore my face walked over to me. It reached out and picked me up. I tried to struggle, but I was stiff, frozen in a single, seated pose. It carried me to the corner of the room, to the place where the refrigerator had been. The appliance was gone. In its place was the pile of junk I had found in the basement, the rusty bird cages, the heavy chest. The entity placed me gently on the top of the pile. My vision was fixed, unable to blink. I stared out of my single glass eye. I watched as the man who was now me walked toward the exit, whistling a tune I used to hum. He reached for the light switch. "Goodbye," he whispered. He flicked the switch. The kitchen went dark, the soil pressed against the glass, and in the silence of the basement, I waited for the next leak and for the next man to come down and find me.